This series is based upon and inspired by the 2021 series Squid Game, created by Hwang Dong-hyuk and produced by Netflix. It also features art created by the fabulous Andrew MacLaine. One hour after Pat, player 177, entered the bathroom, Blue Guard, Yellow Guard, and Orange Guard are waiting in a gallery that overlooks the front of the dormitory. This rectangular room is lined with shiny oak walls, one of which holds several pieces of recently created art. The side of the room facing the dormitory features a long window, directly above the screen within the dormitory. In the centre of the gallery is a long mahogany table. 6 matching chairs are lined along one side, while another is placed across the table, with its back to the dormitory. Several sofas, a large television, and a bank of small screens are placed on the left side of the gallery, while a small bar and accompanying stools are located on the right side. Furthermore, like all areas throughout the compound, the gallery contains cameras, with one in each corner of the ceiling. Blue Guard is stood at the window, using a pair of night vision goggles to look over the darkened dormitory, while Yellow Guard sits at the table and reads through a booklet of the remaining players. As for Orange Guard, he makes himself a glass of Coca-Cola at the bar and thrusts a straw through the small mouth hole in his mask. He consumes the drink in a few seconds, then expels a content belch. After jolting round to this sound, Blue Guard looks back into the dormitory and asks why so many players have come back. Yellow Guard continues to focus on his booklet at the table, but replies that their lives outside will be enough of a reason. A moment later, Green Guard enters the gallery, and after glancing to Blue Guard and Yellow Guard, she joins Orange Guard at the bar. He looks up to see Green Guard approaching, then gestures to the Coke dispenser and asks if she wants some. Green Guard jokingly inquires if it is too early for something stronger. Orange Guard chuckles and walks round to the bar to the alcoholic drinks on the wall. He runs his hand up a bottle of whiskey and tells the bottle that he might destroy it later. As Blue Guard looks round again, Green Guard laughs and says she was joking, but after the next game, the vodka a few bottles along will be hard to resist. Orange Guard nods to the bottle and confidently states how this sounds like a plan. With a light laugh, Green Guard points back to the Coke dispenser and says she will have some. She goes to take a glass from behind the bar, but Orange Guard grabs one and pours 2 more glasses. Green Guard thanks him and the pair clink glasses. Orange Guard begins to ask Green Guard about the state of her private quarters when Purple Guard enters the gallery. She casts her eye around to the other Triangle Guards before approaching Blue Guard, who is still looking through the window with her night vision goggles. Once Purple Guard is stood next to Blue Guard, she asks to borrow her goggles. Blue Guard appears hesitant, but Purple Guard repeats, "Please," in a pleading tone. Blue Guard hesitates, but tentatively hands them over, instructing Purple Guard to be careful. Initially, she does not move the goggles as she observes the sleeping players in the dormitory. However, after 20 seconds, she puts them directly against the window, and Blue Guard urges her to remove them from the glass. Upon hearing the panic in Blue Guard's voice, Orange Guard and Green Guard stop talking and watch from the bar. Purple Guard seems to ignore anyone else and remains focused on the first rows of the dormitory until Blue Guard suddenly shouts to give her the goggles back. Orange Guard sniggers and Purple Guard turns to Blue Guard, then hands the goggles back with a quiet "thank you." After examining the goggles, Blue Guard hurries to place them back in a case on the table, which she proceeds to lock before sitting at the table and letting out a heavy, disgruntled breath. Seconds later, Square Guard enters, wearing his standard black and white suit, along with his black and gold mask. All the Triangle Guards move swiftly to the table and stand behind their assigned seats, with Purple Guard furthest to the right, Blue Guard to her left, then Green Guard, Yellow Guard, and Orange Guard, although the seat on the far left remains empty. Square Guard tells the Triangle Guards to take their seats, and as they do so, he gives a light nod into the nearest camera. He turns back to the Triangle Guards and congratulates them for organising the first ever game in a British Squid Game, adding how this is no easy milestone. As Orange Guard glances at the empty seat to his left, Square Guard continues that a total of 109 of the 118 surviving players decided to return to the games. He informs how this is an average return rate and discusses the measures being used to survey the 9 players who chose not to return. After giving a brief summary of each of these players, Square Guard begins to discuss the events which will follow in the next few days. He divulges that based on what they have seen at the return stage in the 2 Squid Games which have already taken place in his native Korea, the remaining players are likely to become more focused on the prize and even less scared of their probable elimination. Following a pensive moment of silence, Square Guard describes how the process will change for the Triangle Guards as well. He then advises them to focus on their strengths during this time, before asking each of them to name something they have done well so far. Square Guard looks first at Orange Guard, who responds without hesitation that it was his idea to use real bulldogs in the first game. He begins to describe the triggers and sensors used to control the dogs, but Square Guard jokes how he should not give all his secrets away. Orange Guard nods, but chuckles that he thought about using chihuahuas instead. Blue Guard splutters and asks what good those little creatures would do. However, Orange Guard swiftly replies how they can be vicious little forkers, whilst every bulldog he's met has been soft as shirt. Blue Guard fires back until today. Orange Guard begins to respond, but Blue Guard interjects that she is still not happy about the way the bulldogs were treated. Orange Guard chortles, then declares how only one of them needed to be taken to the vet. Besides, they each got a nice bone after the game. Square Guard then turns to Yellow Guard, who simply replies that he has become familiar with the range of players' opinions and attitudes towards these games. Purple Guard looks along the row towards Yellow Guard, whilst Green Guard answers how she enjoyed making the announcements during the game. Blue Guard responds that it was her idea to not replace each eliminated player with a bulldog. She then chuckles that if they had stuck with the original idea, they probably wouldn't have any players left. Orange Guard leans forward and faces Blue Guard. Square Guard asks Purple Guard the same question, as she briefly holds her head at an angle, then responds that although she has already done many things well, she managed to break up a fight in the dormitory after the first game. As Green Guard brings a hand to her mouth, Square Guard nods and tells the Triangle Guards that it is also important to remember how they can become even more effective in this process. Without pausing for breath, he turns to Orange Guard once more and asks what he will aim to do differently in future games. The other players seem slightly taken aback, but Orange Guard heartily answers how he will try to use original ideas in his games. Square Guard quietly responds that he looks forward to seeing what Orange Guard has planned. Yellow Guard is asked next, and he answers how from now on, he will make sure all Circle Guards know exactly where they need to be at all times. Square Guard nods as this answer is given, and articulates how extremely important this is for the entire games to function smoothly. He turns to Green Guard, who says that she will enjoy being in charge for the second game. Blue Guard is the next to answer. She gestures to Green Guard and asks if she could give the same answer, to which Square Guard nods, adding how they are all about to be in charge of their own games. Finally, Square Guard turns to Purple Guard, who says that she wants to crack down on shoddy behaviour between games. A brief silence follows, then without speaking, Square Guard gets up from his chair and walks over to the window. He looks out into the dormitory and states that while these are all decent suggestions, they must also, however, realise it is not their responsibility to hand out food to players or to take them to the bathroom. He explains how these duties are below their rank, and they should instead focus on the design and fruition of the upcoming games. This instruction is met with nods from most of the Triangle Guards, and Orange Guard even responds, "Yes, sir." Square Guard asks if there are any further questions, and Blue Guard raises her hand, but Purple Guard immediately asks where Red went. Yellow Guard and Blue Guard both glance across to Purple Guard, and Square Guard looks at her for a few quiet seconds, then answers that he eliminated Mr. Red from the process. With a hint of amusement, Purple Guard repeats, "Mr. Red?" Square Guard nods, before explaining how at the end of these games, only one of them will be receiving the position, and he therefore has to eliminate some of them throughout the process in order to have a better focus on those remaining. Blue Guard raises her hand once more, but Square Guard turns back to the window and instructs the Triangle Guards to join him. As they gather with him at the window, Square Guard takes out the remote control from his pocket and gently turns a button, which illuminates the dormitory. The Triangle Guards look through the window and are now able to see that just over half of the beds contain players, with Circle Guards patrolling between them. Square Guard instructs the Triangle Guards how from this point on, they will have sole authority over the Circle Guards and players, and they will need to decide as a group and as individuals on how to use this authority. Square Guard lowers the dormitory lights back to the dark blue hue and informs the Triangle Guards that they now have 30 minutes to revise their final instructions for the second game. This is met with sounds of understanding, and Squareguard informs how they must also decide when they will awaken players and which instructions to give. However, just as he is finishing this sentence, an urgent knocking is heard on the door, and a circle guard hurriedly enters. He apologizes for the interruption, but pants that there has been a situation in the back bathroom. Squareguard thanks him with a slightly concerned tone, then looks between the triangle guards before gesturing to Blue Guard and informs that Miss Blue here will deal with the situation. The other triangle guards look to Blue Guard, and Orange Guard lets out a disgruntled sound of confusion. Blue Guard steps forward and delicately responds, "Mrs. Blue." Squareguard apologizes, corrects himself, and leaves the room. The Circle Guard then frantically informs how a player has been stabbed dead in the bathroom at the far end. A little over an hour later, Land of Hope and Glory by Edward Elgar plays through the dormitory speakers. The anthem begins quietly, but rises in volume. The lights illuminate the dormitory, and players awaken. 30 Circle Guards enter through the doors beneath the screen, hurrying to form a line along the front of the platform. Following them are the 5 Triangle Guards, who place themselves at equidistant intervals across the platform. While some players rise from their beds and begin to talk to each other, Mrs. Blue's distorted voice sounds from the speakers, calling for them to listen. The anthem quietens, and once silence has been achieved from players, she thanks and welcomes them back to the Squid Game. Mrs. Blue produces a remote control from her pocket and presses a button, which displays the prize fund of £7,700,000 on the screen. She reiterates how someone here will win this money, which triggers some cautious expressions of optimism throughout the dormitory. As Mrs. Blue steps back, Mr. Yellow steps forward and announces that the second game will start in 1 hour. Some players shout out, desperately asking what game this is, but Mr. Yellow replies in a somewhat mischievous tone how all will be revealed in due course. A few players are still loudly demanding answers when Miss Green steps forward and states that food packages and water will now be given out. Her voice is audible from the speakers, but players' questions are drowning out the information she is giving. Miss Green falters when she seems to realise that many players are not listening, and Mr. Orange makes a quiet psst sound to get her attention. She darts her gaze towards him, and he whispers that she needs to get silence. Miss Green looks back to the players, more of whom are now shouting out or talking amongst themselves. After a few seconds, she snatches the remote control from Mrs. Blue's hand, then turns up one of the dials. Miss Green's voice suddenly booms from the speakers, demanding silence. Many players wince from the volume, and some hold their ears in pain. Miss Green waits for them to settle, then declares how she was about to tell players about their breakfast, but any who do not listen can go without. A pin can be heard to drop throughout the dormitory as Miss Green readjusts the volume on the remote control. She exhales into the microphone and instructs players to remain in their assigned rows, where food packages and water bottles will be distributed in a few minutes. Trolleys containing food packages and water bottles are wheeled through the front doors by Circle Guards. Miss Green informs how for the next hour, players are free to eat, use the bathroom, and do as they please, before ending with a civil "thank you." Whilst the players resume their conversations, Miss Green turns and thanks Mr. Orange. Before he can reply, Mrs. Blue demands the remote control back from Miss Green. She gives it back, but as she proceeds to talk to Mr. Orange, she fails to notice Mrs. Blue glaring at her from the other side. Still sat on his bed, Alan, player 23, watches the Triangle Guards head back through the front doors. He then looks blankly to the right and sees the pink Mohican of Helen, player 22, emerge from beneath her bedsheet. Alan watches Helen pull back the sheet and blink thrice, covering her eyes from the lights above. She grimaces and shuffles to the side, which causes her to tip over the side of the bed. Still not fully awake, Helen gasps in anguish as her right shoulder hits the ground. Alan rushes forward and asks if she's all right, but after receiving no response, he slowly helps her to her feet. Helen squints at the lights above as she tries to hold her balance. She grips onto Alan's arm, and he asks again if she is feeling all right, but she allows her eyes to adjust and responds that she is just a little light-headed. Alan nods, then Helen lets go of his arm and walks along the row of beds, although she soon begins to grimace from the surrounding noise and lights. She stops and grips onto the empty bed of player 27, whilst player 17, the old Geordie woman, gives her an uneasy look from the row in front. Yusuf, player 28, grabs the duvet from the empty bed of player 29 to create a makeshift prayer mat. He kneels down and is about to begin his morning prayer when he notices Helen from the corner of his eye. She sees Yusuf as well and notices a heavy bruise below his right eye. Helen asks what happened. For a few seconds, Yusuf seems torn between answering her question and beginning his prayers, until he sits back up and responds that he had too much to drink and fell against a door. Helen frowns with amusement and says she thought Muslims did not drink alcohol. Yusuf appears unsure of how to respond, yet Helen says she won't tell and grins. Yusuf gives her a cautious smile, but just when she is about to walk away, he asks where she's from. Player 18, the short, skin-headed man, watches with interest from the row in front as Helen and Yusuf acquaint themselves and share their opinions of Leeds and Bradford. While Player 18 and Player 14, the young man with a long side parting, proceed to quietly yet openly mock Yusuf, Alan looks around until he spots Tracy, Player 26, on her bed. She gives a quick, habitual smile, then turns and lies back on her bed, staring up to the ceiling. At this moment, the first row of players receive their food packages and bottles of water. Helen claims she is dying for some water, but Alan responds that she only needs to wait a little longer. He then notices Player 25's empty bed and asks where he has gone. Yusuf looks over and seems unsure of who Player 25 was, until Alan reminds that he was the man who thought someone robbed him. Helen jokes how he might be out there somewhere looking for his ring. From her bed, Tracy hears this discussion and smiles, gazing to the £7,700,000 on the screen above. Whilst the third row receive their food packages and water bottles, Steve, Player 98, lies within his bed and timidly looks around. Player 109, the young man with greying hair, gestures to the nearest wall and jokes how they could have afforded to give the place a lick of paint. Steve smiles at him in agreement. As Player 109 gets up and stretches his calf muscles over the side of his bed, Steve suddenly turns to the right and looks over to see Diane, Player 96, and Mary, Player 95. He appears surprised, but somewhat relieved to see them both in their beds. Mary cautiously rises from her bed, then turns towards Diane and gently calls her name. Still lying within the sheets of her bed, Diane watches with a dull expression as Mary approaches. Mary calls to ask if Diane is there, when she hears the laugh of Player 86, a young man with patchy freckles and a scratched face, who appears amused by the wary look forming on Diane's face. After letting out a reluctant tut, Mary turns to Player 86, then gestures to Diane's bed and asks why she would have come back when she probably has more money than everyone in here put together. Player 86 laughs as he watches Diane's bottom lip drop. Mary grins, however, and states that she could do with a spare blanket, as it was too cold last night. She reaches towards the blanket on Diane's bed when Diane finally uses her voice, warning Mary to get away from her bed if she does not want to lose any of her 4 remaining senses. Steve cringes as he watches this scene. Mary freezes, yet a second later she reanimates and claims Diane is a silly cow. Diane gasps and asks if Mary really just called her a cow. Mary confidently nods and gets up from her bed. She then asks in return if Diane has memory loss, as she could break her neck in a second. Steve gets up and rushes over, but Diane breathes out in dismissal and huffs at Mary to fuck off. She storms off, passing Steve without a word. Mary seems taken aback by Diane's sudden absence, but mutters to herself that she's hungry. Looking over to see the 5th row receiving their food packages and water bottles, Steve answers that there is food on its way. Mary jolts around and calls out to Steve. As he approaches Mary's bed and takes her outstretched hand, she smiles and exclaims that she did not expect to hear him again. Diane watches them in bewilderment from the empty bed of Player 88, until Steve notices her and she rapidly turns away. However, Steve continues to look at Diane from behind, and with confusion in his voice, quietly states that she really wanted to leave. Diane appears to hear him and turns back. Steve asks if she does not already have enough money. She glares at him, but simply replies how some things are more important than money. For the next few seconds, none of this trio speak amidst the many sounds throughout the dormitory. Mary then asks if the woman with kids came back, pointing to the bed of Player 85. Steve shrugs that her bed is empty, and with a smile, Mary comments, "Good." Still sat over on the bed of Player 88, Diane turns to Steve and asks why he changed his mind about continuing the games. He looks down in reflection, but answers how he wanted to try again. Steve squints and comments that he did not expect either of them to come back either. Diane looks away and mutters to herself, "Neither did I." A minute later, when the 10th row are receiving their packages and bottles, Joanne, Player 175, is lying on her bed and talking to Nicholas, Player 173. She attempts to guess what the second game involves, and Nicholas soon finds himself sharing his theories. After Joanne explains her reason for disliking Jenga, Nicholas looks to the bed of Pat, player 177, and asks where she is. Joanne gestures to the 108 players remaining on the screen, and replies that the number has gone down from 118, so 10 people must have chosen not to come back. However, Nicholas signals to the swept-back sheets of Pat's bed, and suggests that she must have been sleeping in it. In response, Joanne suggests how maybe the guards forgot to make her bed, as there is no way she came back. At that moment, both Joanne and Nicholas are distracted by shouting from the nearest corner of the dormitory. They look over to see player 194, a feeble-looking woman with grubby hair, who is addressing player 191, the giant of a man, as Charlie, and unsuccessfully trying to calm him down. Joanne squints at Charlie, player 191, and asks what his number is, explaining how she struggles to read numbers. Nicholas looks pensively to Joanne for a few seconds, but when she looks back, he gives a reassuring smile and replies 191. Charlie shouts in anger that he did not get to say goodbye to his son. Player 194 listens as Charlie shudders that there were so many things he wanted to tell him. After watching a little longer, Joanne sullenly lies back on her bed and stares to the ceiling. Nicholas expresses how he hopes the second game is noughts and crosses, or something simple. Without moving, Joanne replies that she would prefer Twister, as she has never lost a game in her life. Nicholas responds that Twister is American, but Joanne gestures around them, and comments how these people don't seem to follow the usual rules. Nicholas seems ready to reply, when Joanne asks if he thinks Rubik's Cubes are one of these games. Nicholas watches player 194 burst into tears in the corner when Charlie storms back to his bed. Yet after a few seconds, he looks back and asks how Rubik's Cubes could be used for a game here, especially given that most people won't be able to crack one. Joanne shrugs, but shares that she tried to complete one when they were first released, although she could never figure them out. Nicholas responds how he has never tried to use one, then jokes that he would be as useless as a chocolate teapot if he tried. Player 171, a man in his late 20s with glasses and strawberry blonde curls, interjects from a few beds over that he still enjoys solving Rubik's Cubes sometimes. Joanne twists round and asks if he has ever finished one. He claims he has, but only with the help of his little brother, who is much better at them. Nicholas watches with a curious grin, and Joanne says that if they somehow got hold of one, he must teach her how to complete it. Player 171 nods and agrees to this, when Joanne says how much she loves his hair, as it looks like beautiful spaghetti. He laughs and claims this is the nicest compliment he has received in a while, before introducing himself as Jeff, player 171. Joanne introduces herself, then Nicholas, who cordially nods back. For the rest of the hour, the Triangle guards look out from the gallery to see most players eating, drinking, or resting on their beds, with some discussing what the second game will involve. Towards the end of this time, Mrs. Blue and Mr. Orange notice that a sizable number of players are heading to the bathrooms, whilst others seem to become more tense and nervous. Miss Purple also spends time observing Alan, who stops eating and hides his remaining food and water under his bedsheet, then sits almost completely still upon his bed. Some players form their own games, including Joanne, Nicholas, and Jeff, who play What's the Time, Mr. Wolf, at the far end of the dormitory with a number of other players. The Triangle guards access a better view of this distant row of beds through a bank of screens in the gallery. Mr. Yellow seems particularly interested by this game, and Mrs. Blue soon joins him, commenting that when she was a girl, she was the best on the street at this game. At the end of the hour, the Triangle guards enter the dormitory and call for silence. When all players are stood by their beds, each row is escorted towards the front of the dormitory by a Triangle guard and Circle guard. After Mr. Yellow and Mr. Orange lead the first and second rows respectively, Miss Purple calls for the next row to follow her. Player 21, the tall young man with spiky black hair, Helen, player 22, Alan, player 23, Tracy, player 26, and Yusuf, player 28, do as they are asked, although when Yusuf passes Miss Purple, he stops and turns to face her. In her distorted voice, Miss Purple growls at Yusuf to keep moving. However, he remains still, then forms an amused frown, and curiously asks what's wrong with Foster's beer. While some players in earshot appear confused by this question, Miss Purple claims she has no idea what Yusuf is talking about. He gives a knowing smirk, and she lets out a slow, deep breath from her nostrils, then claims they don't have time for silly questions, and raises her gun, ordering him to move. Upon seeing Miss Purple's gun, Yusuf does as he is asked, and walks ahead, behind Tracy and the rest of the row. Miss Purple follows Yusuf with her gun aimed directly at his back, until he comments that enough beer would probably make him act like a duckhead too. Tracy and Alan both glance round to see the grin on Yusuf's face, although it swiftly disappears when Miss Purple slams her gun into his back. He whispers, "Sorry, Allison," and she growls at him to be quiet. Yusuf continues to march on behind Alan and Tracy, struggling to hide his grin as Miss Purple storms after him. The 5 players of this row are led by a circle guard through the doors beneath the screen, then along the metallic corridor and down to the car park, in which the fleet of trucks are waiting to take them to the next game. 5 minutes later, the truck carrying the 6 players from the 10th row is starting its journey along a road through a thick, sunlit forest. Mary, player 95, quietly asks Steve, player 98, what he can see from the back of the truck, but he appears dazed and distracted when they accelerate down the road. Mary asks once more, and Steve suddenly turns to her with an impatient expression. He replies, "Trees," which seems to confuse Mary, and she looks round to the other players, all of whom stay quiet. Yet after a few seconds, Diane, player 96, pensively exhales and narrates from the adjacent seat that she only saw the grotty corridor after leaving the dormitory, and they are now driving through a huge forest. Mary hesitantly thanks Diane, who says nothing, but watches Mary's focused expression as she seems to try listening for any discernible sound over the truck's engine. Diane cautiously apologizes for threatening Mary earlier, explaining that she was and still is scared to death. Steve seems very surprised by Diane's apology, and Mary blinks in disbelief but thanks her. The driver turns round and yells to be quiet. The conversation ends, and Steve manages a nervous smile to Diane, yet she closes her eyes and finds her legs shaking as they travel onwards to the second game. Less than 2 minutes later, this truck turns off the road and onto a muddier track. It zigzags down a valley, then comes to a stop in a grassy, weed-filled clearing. Not far ahead is a disused stone building of only 2 stories, which is not small, but nowhere near the size of the arena in which the first game was played. 15 minutes later, almost all 108 players are sat in the centre of a room on the building's lower floor. Illuminated only by a few small windows on a side wall, this room is large, dank and cold, with a scratched brick floor, although a newly painted red door is installed on the front wall. The circle guards surround the players, who are instructed as they enter the room to sit in rows according to their player numbers. Those with higher numbers are sat at the front of the room, nearer to the red door, while those with lower numbers are further back. The circle guards also ensure that the 36 players at the front with the highest numbers are sat in rows of 6, whereas the other 72 players with lower numbers are sorted into rows of 8. Whilst players are waiting for the last row to arrive, Diane grimaces and sniffs the musty air around her, but says nothing. Mary, who is sat next to her, whispers that she can smell this too. Diane turns to Mary, who quietly asks what she can see. Diane's nose crinkles, and she looks around, until Steve interjects that this entire place looks like somewhere the military once trained. Mary's eyes open intently, as Steve voices how this building looks like one the army would have used a long time ago for soldiers to sleep in. He then states, however, that they probably would have slept upstairs, so maybe it was the cafeteria, where the soldiers would have eaten. With a smile, Mary informs how they are called canteens, not cafeterias, and the smell is even worse when the food is being served. Diane asks how Mary knows about the smell of army food, to which she responds that she ate it for years. Player 92, an older woman with a pointed nose, is sitting on the other side of Mary and looks across to Steve and Diane, then gestures to her own eyes and mouths, "Ow." Mary turns to player 92 and replies with an ironic smile that she could of course see back then. Player 92 appears somewhat embarrassed, but before she can respond, players 192, 194, the feeble-looking woman, 195, 197, a young man with bleached blonde hair, 198, an older balding man, and 200, a young woman with a short auburn perm, are escorted into the canteen by Mrs. Blue, then ordered to sit in a row at the front. Seconds later, Square Guard enters the room, and the players and guards fall silent as he approaches the line of triangle guards. After a pensive breath, Square Guard nods to Mr. Orange, who readily steps forward and announces that the second game is about to begin. He orders the front row of players to stand, then gestures to the red door and orders them to go through. These players stand, with various levels of nerves. Player 194 begins to plead that she has changed her mind and wants to go home, although Mr. Orange marches towards her with his gun, and her protest swiftly ends. After 30 seconds, all 6 of these players have walked through the red door, which is instantly closed behind them, despite the echoes of Player 194's cries still audible within the canteen. With the circle guards maintaining surveillance over the players in the canteen, the triangle guards and square guard head back through a battered old door on the side wall. Some quiet chatter builds amongst the awaiting players until muffled thuds and shouts begin to sound behind the red door, which causes more and more players to focus in this direction. Over the next few minutes, the muffled clamour continues from the next room, and some players begin to talk once more. The volume almost returns to its previous level, until a series of shots blasts out from behind the red door. Many players scream in shock and terror, and a few jump up, including player 148, a young Asian woman with long plaited hair, who charges towards the battered door. However, she is quickly caught by a circle guard, who throws her to the ground and points a gun in her face. She screams, but scarpers back, while the other panicked players are also silenced by the threat of guns. Once peace is fully restored within the canteen, it is announced that players 192, 194, the feeble-looking woman, and 195 have been eliminated. Gasps follow, until a screen activates and shows the prize fund of £7,700,000, increasing to £8 million. Helen winces and grips her head, while Tracy looks past Yusuf and gently smiles to player 32, a young woman with bushy peroxide bangs, who is sat at the end of their row. It is then announced that players 197, the young man with bleached blonde hair, 198, the older balding man, and 200, the young woman with a short auburn perm, have passed this game. Alan notices Helen's discomfort, and he gently tells her that she will be okay. She lurches forward and vomits onto the floor. Several players recoil and move away, with Alan gasping in disgust. Player 19, a pretty young woman with a blonde bob, squeamishly shouts from the other side of their row that she is scared of puke. Player 18, the short skin-headed man, who is also sat on their row, covers his mouth and shouts that she has the lurgy. One of the nearby circle guards rushes in with a mop and quickly begins to clean the floor, while another gives Helen a bucket and bottle of water. Meanwhile, in what is now the second row to the front, Nicholas looks back to the front and asks Joanne why they are in lines of 6 when the others behind them are in lines of 8. Joanne seems unsure, and Nicholas raises his hand, yet before any circle guards notice, Jeff, player 171, tells Nicholas to put his hand down, as he does not want to make himself a target. Nicholas appears confused, but Joanne nods at this suggestion, and Nicholas lowers his hand. She then jolts back to Jeff and asks for any advice on using a Rubik's Cube. He frowns and asks why and how this could help, although Joanne interrupts, bluntly ordering him to just tell her everything he can. After a hesitant pause, Jeff explains that you need to focus on the white side first. Joanne interrupts that she already knows this, when the next row, consisting of players 182, 184, 185, 187, a well-built Sikh man, 189, a young woman with long ginger curls, and Charlie, player 191, are then ordered to stand. Most of them get up with even more caution than the previous 6 players, and a circle guard practically pushes player 189 towards the next room. She tearfully begs to go home, but within a minute, she and the other 5 players have gone through the red door. For the following few minutes, many players are sat silently, with a few crying or shaking with nerves. A scattering of hushed conversations occur, mainly regarding what is happening behind the door, although the voice of player 54, an old man with rosacea skin and greying hair, gradually becomes more audible. As the enthusiasm rises in his voice, more players begin to listen, until he is almost shouting that they are reaping what they sow, and along with AIDS, the floods and famine, this place is another punishment from God. Circle guards do not act at first, but watch several players protest, and some shout to player 54 to be quiet, including Alan. However, player 54 ignores these pleas, and gets to his feet, bellowing out that this is the work of the whores, adulterers, and homosexuals, who are infecting this country with their filth. Even more players protest, and some get up to approach player 54 as he hurriedly recites several verses from the Bible. Joanne gets to her feet and looks ready to charge at him, when a circle guard grabs onto her shoulder from behind. Several other guards order player 54 to be quiet, and after being threatened with their guns, he reluctantly stops preaching, then sits down. Other players affected begin to calm down, but just when the volume is returning to a normal level, several more shots ring out from behind the door. This time, fewer players seem distressed, and it is subsequently announced that players 182, 184, and 185 have been eliminated, whilst players 187, the well-built Sikh man, 189, the young woman with long ginger curls, and 191, Charlie, have passed this game. A minute later, the next row, featuring Jeff, Nicholas, and Joanne, are ordered forward by the circle guards. Joanne's eyes widen, and her skin turns pale as she gets to her feet. Nicholas notices and pats her back, assuring they will get through this together. Joanne gives him a hopeful smile and turns to Jeff, who nods back reassuringly. Nicholas observes the other players on their row as they are ushered to the red door. Player 178, a young man with shining white teeth, beams confidently and leads the way, while player 180, a brittle woman in her late 30s with a scratched face and withered veins, grimly stares to the floor as she walks behind him. When they stop by the red door, player 181 removes his large horn-rimmed glasses, wipes them on his tracksuit, and coughs deeply, before repositioning them over his nose. They are escorted through the red door, and the 6 players are clearly surprised by the small size of the metallic space in which they are now stood. Only one circle guard is present in this room, which features nothing but a white door on the wall to the right. However, once the red door to the canteen is closed behind them, the circle guard presses a button next to the white door, which swings open to the next room. Nicholas leads the way into a much larger and higher room of approximately 10 meters in length and almost the same width. A black line runs along the floor, dividing the room into left and right halves. The left half's floor is a deep blue, whereas that of the right half is light orange. Each side also contains a bright green square in its centre. The walls of this room are painted a perfect white, but they feature some wet smudges, with spots that resemble pink paint. Each half of the room also contains 3 large transparent boxes, placed on podiums against the side walls. A screen is placed over each set of boxes, displaying the message, "Do not touch." As players move further into the room, they see that each side's left box holds only 10 large red Lego blocks, measuring 20 centimeters in length and width, and 10 centimeters in height. The middle boxes of each side contain 40 yellow Lego blocks that are 10 centimeters in length and width, and just 5 centimeters in height. However, both right-hand boxes hold a total of 96 small green Lego blocks of just 5 centimeters in length and width and 2.5 centimeters in height. The door to this room closes behind, and although some players look towards it with suspicion and worry, Joanne and player 178, the man with shining teeth, walk ahead towards the boxes on the orange side of the room. Nicholas, Jeff, and player 180, the withered woman, look around from the centre of the room, whilst player 181, the spectacled man, examines the bright green square of the blue side. When Joanne is close enough to the box with smaller green blocks on the orange side, she frowns and squints as she leans over to see its contents. Player 178 inserts his hand and picks up some blocks, then chuckles that he has not played with Lego in years. Joanne turns and swears under her breath. This is not noticed by any other players, and she glares up into the nearest camera. Adjusting his glasses, player 181 rushes over to player 178, who is now moving the blocks around in the box. Player 181 gestures to the screen above and shouts how they are not allowed to touch these blocks. Without turning, player 178 asks what more can be done to them when they are already in hell. Player 181 frowns, but examines the smaller green blocks in the box on the right. He gazes towards the middle box holding the medium-sized yellow box, then across to the left box, containing the larger red blocks. Joanne notices player 181's thoughtful expression, and he looks up to see her watching him. He asks why the blocks are different colours, and Joanne lightly shakes her head with uncertainty, but comments that they make a traffic light. Player 181 becomes distracted when player 178 dives his hand into the next box containing the medium-sized yellow box. Upon seeing the worry on player 181's face, Joanne looks over and tells player 178 how maybe he should not touch the blocks, as this might get them all into trouble. Player 178 looks at her playfully for a few seconds before removing his hand with a merry flourish. He grins and flashes his teeth, then offers this hand, introducing himself as Brian. Joanne shakes his hand and introduces herself. The other players also exchange names, with players 180 and 181 revealing theirs to be Sue and Ralph respectively. During this time, the players are being watched from a gallery on the far wall, which sits behind one-way glass and is hence hidden from their vision. The triangle guards are sat in brightly decorated yet comfortable armchairs, from which they have a perfect view of the room below. Mr. Yellow is stood ahead of them, behind a small table of control buttons, along with Square Guard, who is scribbling some notes on a clipboard. When Square Guard finishes writing, he tells Mr. Yellow that the game he just conducted with the previous 6 players was entertaining and featured an interesting application of the rules. Mr. Yellow nods thankfully, and as he returns to the other triangle guards, Miss Green compliments his rule switch and claims she did not expect those 3 to pull a blinder like that. Square Guard then calls Mrs. Blue forward. Once she has stood at the control table, Square Guard orders her to familiarize herself with the controls and begin instructions when she is ready. For a short while, Mrs. Blue watches the players examining the room below, then she looks back down to the controls, whilst Jeff and Sue, player 180, inspect the pink smudges on the blue side's wall. However, as Sue nears one of these marks, she slips and bangs her elbow against the wall. She moans in pain and grips her emaciated arm. Jeff notices some fluid that she has slipped on, which is dripping from the pink smudge that they were inspecting. He offers a hand down to Sue when she notices Brian, player 178, smirking at her from the orange side of the room. She slaps Jeff's hand out of the way and shouts that he tripped her. Other players look over, and Jeff immediately denies this allegation. While Sue gets to her feet with a dirty frown, the voice of Mrs. Blue is heard, calling for players' attention. They all stop and look around, until they seem to realise that her voice is emanating from the screens above the boxes. She then orders for players 171, Jeff, 173, Nicholas, and 175, Joanne, to move to the blue side on the left of the room, and players 178, Brian, 180, Sue, and 181, Ralph, to move to the opposite orange side. This is done silently, with Sue glaring at Brian as she approaches him by the podiums. Nicholas, on the other hand, appears pleased to see Joanne joining him on the blue side. When all players are stood by the podiums in their respective halves of the room, Mrs. Blue welcomes them to Game 2, Lego Towers. Joanne tuts and looks anxiously to the boxes behind her, while Sue scratches her arms in a discontent fashion. Mrs. Blue reveals that the 3 players on the left side will form the blue team, whilst the 3 on the right side will form the orange team. Players look towards their opponents, and Brian snarls straight into Joanne's eyes. It is then explained how for this game, each team will have 2 minutes to build the highest tower possible, using only the blocks in their halves of the room. Once the time has ended, the team with the highest tower will win, while the team with the smaller tower will be eliminated. Mrs. Blue stipulates that towers must be built upon the green squilding bears provided. She quickly corrects this as building squares. Brian gives a strange look to the screen, but Mrs. Blue calmly continues that players are not allowed to cross the black line into the other team's side of the room. A few seconds later, she asks if there are any questions. Nobody says anything, and the screens above the boxes both switch to display 2 minutes. Following a brief pause, she declares that their time will begin in 3, 2, 1. Most players look flustered and surprised that the game is about to begin, but before the countdown has even ended, they are already rushing back to the boxes. In the gallery, Mrs. Blue exhales and grips her forehead, incredulously repeating "squilding bears." Square Guard tells her not to worry if she makes mispronunciations, and she slowly nods back. The other triangle guards sit forward in their chairs and watch players frantically reaching into the boxes. Mr. Orange lets out a breathy giggle and says his money is on the orange team with 4 eyes. On the blue side, Nicholas yanks out the big red blocks from the left box and tosses them towards the building square, whilst Jeff scoops out the medium-sized yellow box and Joanne pulls out the small green blocks. Nicholas soon finishes emptying the big red blocks and moves to help Jeff with the medium-sized yellow blocks. Joanne begins to struggle with the smaller green blocks and appears surprised, but concerned by how quickly Jeff and Nicholas are emptying the middle box. Nevertheless, she continues removing the smaller green blocks. Jeff soon notices her troubled expression and hurriedly asks if she needs help. Nicholas reaches over and grabs 2 of these green blocks, but looks at them strangely and mutters that they must be made of concrete. Jeff briefly tries to lift a side of the box containing these green blocks, but notices it is fused to the podium. Nicholas realises that the box cannot be tipped over, and he orders Jeff to chuck out the medium-sized yellow blocks, whilst he helps Joanne pull out the remaining green blocks. Within 20 seconds, all the blue team's red and yellow blocks, along with half their smaller green blocks, lie between the boxes and the building square. During this time on the orange side of the room, Ralph, player 181, carries the red blocks to their building square, then places them carefully on top of each other. Meanwhile, Sue, player 180, struggles to lift out all the medium-sized yellow blocks at a fast enough rate. Brian, player 178, has thrown roughly half of the small green blocks from their box. He runs over to Sue and tells her to hurry. She mumbles that she is going as fast as she can, but Brian ignores her and throws the yellow blocks over his shoulder towards the building square. One of them hits the back of Ralph's leg, and he turns round, looking ready to shout something, until Brian throws another of these yellow blocks, which clips the corner of the small tower Ralph has constructed so far. It shakes to one side and almost falls off its base. Ralph hurries to grab the side of the tower, then straightens its base once more. He places some of the medium-sized yellow blocks on top of the larger red blocks, but as more of the yellow blocks fly nearer the tower, he shouts at Brian to hold on. Brian twists around and growls that there's no time to waste. He notices the timer passing through 1 minute 30, then shouts at Sue to help Ralph. Without a word, she scoops up some of the yellow blocks, runs over, and plonks them on top of the tower. It shudders a little, and Ralph frantically tells Sue to slow down. She says nothing, but crouches down and grabs some more of the medium-sized yellow blocks from by her feet, whilst Ralph neatly places them into levels of 4, so that they cover the square surface of the large red blocks below. On the blue side of the room, Joanne is building the tower for her team, but she has only just finished laying the 10 red blocks. Nicholas continues to pull out the smaller yet heavier green blocks, as Jeff moves them and the yellow blocks towards the building square. With 1 minute 15 remaining, Brian is still scooping out the remaining green blocks from the box on the orange side. He then tosses them towards their tower, which is now almost 1.5 meters high. Noticing the difference in heights between the two towers, Jeff runs over to help Joanne place the yellow blocks onto the red blocks of their tower. However, just after he forms a square on top with 4 yellow blocks, Joanne glances to the other half of the room and spots a crack forming in a lower red block of the orange team's tower. While Sue keeps piling on more yellow blocks to her team's tower, Jeff places another 4 yellow blocks onto the blue team's tower, but Joanne suddenly tells him to stop. He shoots her a stressed frown, and she whispers that the other team's tower is breaking. Nicholas finally brings over the last of the green blocks and asks Joanne why she has stopped. At this moment, a loud crack sounds from the orange team's tower. Ralph is just about to place another yellow block on top of this tower when he hears this sound and holds back. Yet Sue keeps picking up yellow blocks from the floor, which he hurries to put on top of this tower. Ralph quickly inspects the lower half, but just as he spots the crack in the side, a similar sound is heard again, and another crack forms in the block above. Ralph shouts at Sue to stop. She places another yellow block on top and turns to Ralph, who panics that their tower is going to fall. Brian then runs in with the last of the small green blocks and shouts at them to keep going. Ralph turns to Brian and replies in a panic that their tower is breaking, when Sue plonks down 2 more yellow blocks on top. Ralph looks around and gasps as the lower red block completely crumbles, causing the corner of the tower to give way. The whole structure falls sideways and smashes into the orange floor. Nicholas and Jeff look in shock to Ralph, who begins to scream at Brian how he did not listen. In return, Brian slaps Ralph across the face and shouts at him to pick up these blocks and start again. Nicholas shoots a grin to Joanne, yet she twists back and pulls off the medium-sized yellow blocks from the top of their tower. Nicholas asks in a bewildered tone what she is doing, to which she replies that the red blocks may be the biggest, but they are also the weakest. Whilst Nicholas blinks in confusion, Jeff grabs a handful of the small green blocks from the floor, and his eyes widen in surprise at their weight. Nicholas urges that they are the smallest and need to be on top, but Jeff replies how they must be made from a heavier plastic, which makes them the strongest. His eyes dart towards a nearby pile of the green blocks, and he instructs that they need legs. Meanwhile in the gallery, Squareguard is rapidly making notes on his clipboard, and Mr. Orange is shouting at Four Eyes to grow a pair. Mr. Yellow leans in closer and observes the orange team trying to rebuild their tower, while Mrs. Blue calmly announces into the microphone that they have 1 minute remaining. Brian glances up to the speaker and launches the broken red block from his fallen tower against the wall, before growling at Sue and Ralph to place the red blocks down 2 at a time, then the yellow blocks on top. Sue gormlessly watches on as Ralph protests how the red blocks are not strong enough, but Brian aggressively raises a hand towards him and grumbles that this is why they need to put down 2 at a time. Ralph cowers, and Brian kicks some more blocks towards him. Sue begins to do as ordered, and Ralph hesitantly joins her. On the blue side of the room, Jeff, Nicholas, and Joanne are each scurrying to create a single line of the smaller yet heavier green blocks. Nicholas seems dubious and asks if this will work, but Jeff gestures to the frenzied construction happening on the orange side and whispers how they should stand more chance than that. When Jeff, Nicholas, and Joanne have each connected at least 15 of the green pieces into a line of blocks, Jeff tells his teammates to stop and place these lines on the building square. He pulls off the top blocks from the taller lines and places these legs into 3 points, which effectively form a tripod. With 44 seconds left, Brian, Ralph and Sue have the taller tower on the orange side, with all but one of their red blocks on their building square and half of their yellow blocks on top of this. Ralph looks to the blue side and notices his opponents placing their yellow blocks upon the legs of the smaller but heavier green blocks in an interlocking manner, which shares the combined weight of these blocks between the 3 legs below. Ralph stresses to Brian and Sue that they need to use the green blocks as the base, but Brian shouts back how they all break as they are smaller. Ralph shakily grabs a green block from the ground and shouts that they are heavier, although Brian does not listen, and helps Sue put more yellow blocks on top of their tower. While Ralph helplessly looks on, Nicholas continues to pass the yellow blocks to Joanne and Jeff. They carefully connect these blocks to the top of their tower, which is now just centimetres shorter than that of the orange team. Mrs. Blue announces that 30 seconds remain, and Ralph tries reasoning again with Brian, who snaps at him to stop whining and help. Meanwhile, Sue places more and more yellow blocks on top of each other in a disorganised and uneven arrangement. Another crack suddenly sounds from a lower level of their tower. Ralph rages into tears, and Brian swears as the tower crashes sideways against Sue, who yelps when a yellow block hits her eye. The timer passes through 22 seconds, and Ralph shouts at Brian to listen. Ralph rapidly explains that the red blocks need to go on top, when Brian grits his teeth and grabs Ralph by the neck. Ralph splutters, but Brian looks over and notices the legs on the blue team's tower. He blinks, then orders Sue and Ralph to make a tower from their green blocks. The orange team speedily proceed to place more and more of these small blocks into a single tower on their building square. On the blue side of the room, Joanne adds the final yellow block to her team's tower, while Jeff looks all around its sides for cracks. However, Nicholas notices the small green blocks being rapidly added in a single line to the orange team's building square. He shouts to Jeff and Joanne that they need to put the larger red blocks on top of their own tower as well, in order to be safe. Nicholas and Joanne hurry to gather the red blocks and pass them to Jeff, who carefully places them on top of their tower. When only 10 seconds remain, Joanne notices the orange team frantically putting their remaining red blocks on top of their thin tower of single green blocks. Joanne anxiously whispers to Jeff to hurry, but as Sue sprints over with some pre-connected yellow blocks, she trips and falls next to her team's tower. Although her head narrowly avoids hitting the tower, its structure is already fragile, and the nearby impact of her fall causes the lower half to break. With 6 seconds left, the upper half of the tower snaps and rains down onto Sue's face, causing her to scream in pain. Ralph watches open-mouthed and in an apparent state of shock as Brian furiously swears at Sue. He kicks her in the stomach, then grabs a red block and chucks it in anger towards the blue team's tower. This hits the very top red block, which flies off the tower, and Joanne gasps in a panic. With 3 seconds remaining, Brian swears in realization and grabs a handful of blocks, which he launches at the legs of the blue team's tower. Although the legs are hit by some blocks, they withstand this impact, and Jeff and Nicholas quickly place themselves in front of their tower. As Mrs. Blue counts down the final 3 seconds, Sue continues to writhe in pain and choke on one of her bloodied teeth, while Ralph watches in disbelief. Yet Brian continues to hurl any blocks he can at the blue team's tower. Jeff and Nicholas continue to defend their tower, and Jeff's left shin is hit by a green block, but the tower remains intact. When the timer hits 0, Ralph breathes out madly, then cries out that it was not his fault their tower fell. Brian seethes until he leans back and lets out a primal roar to the ceiling. A circle guard suddenly marches through the entrance door and points his gun towards the orange side of the room. Brian forcefully charges towards this guard, but he is shot in the chest by a wave of bullets. Ralph gasps, and as he runs away towards the opposite door, he is shot several times through the back and collapses against the door. During these shootings, Nicholas stares blankly, and Jeff backs away, but Joanne crouches down, slams her eyes shut, and covers her ears. The guard approaches Sue within the pile of blocks. Through more bloodied choking, she tearfully extends a scabbed arm. The guard fires 2 bullets into her head, and the arm drops back down. Jeff gulps and feels his face, a side of which has been splattered with Brian's blood. He calmly wipes his t-shirt against this blood, and after a few quiet seconds, it is announced by Mrs. Blue that players 178, 180, and 181 have been eliminated. Noticing Joanne's stunned expression, Nicholas approaches and puts his arm around her, reassuring that they are safe now. He then turns and calls to Jeff, who takes a second to glance over. Nicholas thankfully praises Jeff for his legs idea, adding that he saved all 3 of them. He glances back to the guard's gun, but manages a meagre smile in Nicholas and Joanne's direction. Joanne timidly asks if they can go now. The guard turns to her, nods and instructs them to follow him. They do as ordered, and the guard heads towards the blood-stained door beneath the gallery. He drags Ralph's body to the side, then opens the door and leads the way through. Within a minute, 5 circle guards enter the room. 3 of them remove the bodies and replace any broken blocks. The other 2 clean bloodstains from the floors and walls with a mixture of cleaning spray and hand towels, which leaves a new array of pink smudges against the white paint. In the gallery, Square Guard congratulates Mrs. Blue for producing a clear and concise game. She thanks him, and he continues that it was a good idea of her to not set too many limitations, the final word of which he says following a pensive pause. As Square Guard dismisses Mrs. Blue to sit with the other Triangle Guards, Mr. Orange shouts how this was the quickest anyone has figured it out so far. Miss Green jokes, however, that the Oranges could have easily won if they'd listened to the rules. Mr. Orange nods, but Miss Green laughs and asks if he still bets on 4 eyes. He scoffs and shows the middle finger of his gloved hand. Mrs. Blue sits and asks what 171's profession is. After checking through his player booklet, Mr. Yellow answers that player 171 is an O-level maths teacher from Burnley. Mrs. Blue sighs, then chuckles how teachers in this country aren't paid anywhere near enough. A minute later, the screen in the canteen sounds its optimistic chimes, and the prize fund increases from £8,100,000 to £8,300,000. Alan's foot begins shaking, and his eyes close as the next 6 players are called forward. 5 more games subsequently take place, in which a total of 17 players are eliminated, while 17 pass and return to the dormitory. A clamour of bullets follows each game, but the reaction from the canteen becomes milder each time. Indeed, some players do not bat an eyelid after a while. During this time, a few players seem to realise that whenever a new row is called up to play, only the left or right half of players are eliminated. This idea is initially whispered, but soon spreads through the rows. In hushed tones, many players begin to talk to those on the same side of their row, with some secretively discussing those on the other side. When there are just 2 rows ahead, Steve appears to distract himself by looking at a pattern of rotten brick on a side wall. After hearing the players directly behind introducing themselves to each other, Mary asks Diane who is on their team. Diane looks along their row and replies, "Us 2, Steve, and 101. Mary quietly asks what 101 is like. Diane discreetly peers past Steve and squints to a middle-aged woman with a choppy blonde mullet. Diane whispers that she has an awful hairline and looks like Pat Sharp. Mary screws up her eyes and asks, "What?" Diane dryly explains how he is the host on Funhouse. Mary impatiently whispers how she actually wants to know if 101 looks active or weak. Diane peers back along the row to player 101, who is nervously biting her fingernails. She then turns back to Mary and simply comments, "No." Mary blinks in disbelief, but says not to worry. Following a quick burst of bullets sometime later, it is announced that players 111, 112, 114, and 115 are eliminated. The number of remaining players on the screen drops to 82, but to the surprise of some in the canteen, the prize fund does not increase from £9,400,000. Mary and Diane then hear player 89, a young woman with brown crimped hair, at the other end of their row, introducing herself as Lisa to the others on her side. Player 91, a stocky man in his late 40s, gestures to his injured arm and asks her forgiveness for not shaking hands before giving his name as Keith. Player 92, the older woman with a pointed nose, quietly says her name, but neither Lisa nor Keith can hear her. They look to player 94, a young man with ashy skin and morose lips, although he turns his sagging eyes away and yawns. Diane watches this interaction very carefully, but jumps when she hears a sudden, jagged breath on her other side. She turns to see Steve inhale deeply, then grip onto his shins and stare at the ground. A minute later, their row are called forward by the circle guard. Diane cautiously begins to stand, but notices that Steve is not moving. He quietly mutters that he thinks he is having a panic attack, to which Diane screws up her eyes and responds, "A what?" However, before Steve can say anything else, she grabs him by the arm and orders him to stop being a coward and move. Steve looks blankly up to Diane as she practically drags him to his feet as the other team walk ahead towards the red door. With a sound of worry, Mary asks if Steve is okay. Diane shoots him a knowing look, and after a deep breath, he responds to Mary that he'll be okay.